His retired war dog uncovered a buried bunker and exposed the secret that destroyed his father's life. A frozen Colorado rest stop, a homeless 56-year-old Navy SEAL sleeping in a dying pickup truck. A retired military dog curled beside him against the cold. Ethan Mercer thought life had already taken everything from him, until a stranger offered him abandoned land in the mountains for just $10. But deep beneath the rusted hangar, hidden in Black Hollow Valley, Ranger uncovered something powerful men had been hunting for over 40 years. Comment 1. If you believe loyalty never dies, or 0. if you think some secrets should stay buried, and tell us where you're watching from tonight. The wind coming down from the Colorado mountains sounded like something alive. It scraped across the frozen rest stop outside Grand Junction with a low, hollow moan, rattling the loose metal sign near the highway and pushing thin sheets of snow across the cracked asphalt. Midnight had passed hours ago. The world was empty except for 18-wheelers roaring past on the interstate and an old green pickup truck parked beneath a dead street lamp. Inside the truck, Ethan Mercer slept sitting upright, or at least he tried to. At 56 years old, sleep no longer came easy to him. Not after Afghanistan. Not after the nightmares. Not after 15 years of drifting from one security job to another, carrying memories heavier than the duffel bag behind his seat. The truck smelled faintly of motor oil, cold leather, wet dog fur, and burnt coffee. A German shepherd lay curled across the passenger seat. The dog's muzzle had gone gray around the edges with age, but there was still power in his frame. His ears twitched constantly even in sleep, alert to every distant sound. Ranger. Retired military K9, best partner Ethan had ever had, the only one still left. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windshield. Inside, Ethan jerked awake with a sharp breath. For one terrifying second, he wasn't in Colorado anymore. He was back in Kandahar. Dust, gunfire, a burning convoy, the sound of screaming over the radio. His heart slammed against his ribs. His hand instinctively reached beneath the seat for a weapon that was no longer there. Then Ranger moved. The dog lifted his head immediately, amber eyes calm and steady in the darkness. He rested one heavy paw on Ethan's knee, grounding him, pulling him back. Ethan stared out through the fogged windshield, breathing hard. "It's all right," he muttered hoarsely, though he wasn't sure whether he was talking to Ranger or himself. The dog leaned closer until Ethan's shaking slowed. Outside, another truck thundered past. The headlights swept across the cab for a brief moment, illuminating Ethan's face. Deep lines carved around tired blue eyes, silver threaded through his dark beard. A scar near his temple from a roadside explosion 12 years earlier. Once upon a time, Ethan Mercer had led Navy SEAL teams through war zones. Now he slept in truck stops. Funny how life worked. He rubbed a hand across Ranger's neck. "You hungry, old man?" Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat. Ethan reached into the paper sack beside him and pulled out the last beef jerky strip he had left. He broke it in half carefully. Half for Ranger, half for himself. Dinner. The digital clock on the dashboard blinked 3:17 a.m. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. Ethan pulled his wallet from his coat pocket and counted the bills inside beneath the weak dome light. A 10, a 5, 3 singles, $18. That was everything. $18 and a truck that barely started in the mornings. He stared at the money for a long time before folding it carefully back into the wallet. Ranger watched him quietly. "Don't look at me like that," Ethan said with a tired smile. "I'm still richer than half the idiots I served with." The dog huffed softly. For a moment, the silence inside the truck almost felt peaceful. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He frowned immediately. Almost nobody called him anymore. The screen showed an unknown Montana number. At first, he considered ignoring it, but something made him answer. "Yeah?" The voice on the other end sounded old, thin, careful. "Is this Ethan Mercer?" Ethan straightened slightly. "Who's asking?" My name is Walter Grayson. I'm an attorney calling from Black Hollow, Montana. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What do you want? There was a pause. Then the old man said quietly, I'm calling about your father. The words hit like cold water. Ethan looked away toward the snow-covered highway. He hadn't heard anyone mention Thomas Mercer in years. Not since the funeral. Not since Ethan walked away halfway through it. My father's dead, he said flatly. Yes, Walter Grayson replied gently. He is. Silence filled the truck. Ranger lifted his head higher now, watching Ethan closely. Ethan rubbed his jaw. If this is about debts, I don't have anything. It isn't about debts. Another pause. Your father left you property. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Property? Yes. I think you got the wrong guy. I assure you I did not. The lawyer's voice remained calm. The land is located in Black Hollow Valley. Your father owned it for over 30 years. Ethan stared at the frozen darkness outside. My father hated me. That is not the impression I was given. Ethan ignored that. How much? I beg your pardon. The transfer taxes, filing fees, whatever this is. Walter Grayson hesitated. $10. Ethan blinked once. What? $10, the lawyer repeated. Your father prepaid nearly everything years ago. Only the final transfer fee remains. Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog was fully awake now, watching him. Why would anybody leave me land for $10? That, Walter Grayson said quietly, is something people in Black Hollow have been asking for a very long time. The wind howled outside. Ethan felt something strange move through his chest. Not hope exactly. Something smaller, something more dangerous. Curiosity. What kind of land, he asked. There was another pause. Most people around here would call it abandoned. That's supposed to mean something? Only that many people tried to buy it over the years. How many? The highest offer was just under $700,000. Ethan sat up straight. What? Your father refused every single one. The truck suddenly felt very small, very cold. Why? Walter Grayson's voice lowered. He always said the same thing. Ethan waited. The old attorney inhaled slowly. He said the land belonged to his son, and someday his son would come home for it. Ethan could not speak. Outside, snow drifted across the empty highway under the pale moonlight. Ranger stood now, placing both front paws on the center console, staring directly at Ethan as if he understood every word. Ethan swallowed hard. My father and I didn't speak for 23 years. I know. He never called. I know. He never wrote. Another silence. Then Walter Grayson said softly, that may not be entirely true. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. What's that supposed to mean? It means there are things you don't know, Mr. Mercer. The old lawyer gave him an address in Black Hollow. Then he added one final thing before ending the call. Most people in town believe that property is cursed. Ethan frowned. Cursed how? No one who wanted the land ever managed to keep it. The line went quiet for a moment. And your dog, Walter added carefully. You still have him? Ethan looked at Ranger again. Yeah, good. The lawyer's voice had changed somehow, like relief. Bring him with you. The call ended. For a long time, Ethan simply sat there staring at the dead screen. The heater coughed weakly. Ranger climbed fully across the seat and rested his head against Ethan's shoulder. What do you think? Ethan muttered. The dog's ears twitched. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the mountains far to the west with faint blue light. Ethan reached into his wallet again. He pulled out the $10 bill, held it between his fingers. $10. That was all it would cost to claim land nobody else could have. Land his father protected for 30 years. Land people were still trying to buy. Land an entire town believed was cursed. Ethan looked down at Ranger. You want to go to Montana? The dog's tail thumped hard against the seat. For the first time in months, Ethan laughed. A real laugh. Small, rusted, but real. By sunrise, the truck was rolling north through the Rockies. Snow-covered mountains rose like giants on both sides of the highway. Pine forests stretched endlessly beneath pale winter skies. Frozen rivers glittered beside the road. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat the entire drive, alert, watching. Twice Ethan caught the dog staring toward the distant mountains with unusual intensity, as though he recognized something. The farther north they drove, the stranger Ranger became restless, whining softly whenever Ethan mentioned Black Hollow out loud. At one gas station outside Casper, Wyoming, Ranger suddenly froze beside the truck, ears rigid, eyes locked toward the snowy horizon. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly. The dog gave a low, uneasy growl, not aggressive, warning. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing out there except mountains. White, endless mountains. Still, a cold feeling crept slowly up Ethan's spine. By late afternoon, storm clouds swallowed the sky. The highway narrowed into winding mountain roads coated with fresh snow. A faded sign appeared beside the road. Black Hollow population. 611 below it, someone had spray-painted 3 words in red. "Turn back now." Ethan slowed the truck. Ranger stood immediately, hackles rising. The wind moved through the pine trees with a long, hollow whisper. And somewhere far ahead in those frozen Montana mountains, something was waiting for them. Something that had been waiting a very long time. The road into Black Hollow twisted through the mountains like a scar cut into the wilderness. Snow drifted across the cracked pavement in pale silver waves. Tall pine trees crowded both sides of the road, their dark branches heavy beneath fresh powder. The farther Ethan Mercer drove, the quieter the world became. No gas stations, no billboards, no traffic, just mountains. The truck's tires crunched softly over packed snow as dusk settled over the valley. Ranger had not relaxed once since they crossed the town line. The old German shepherd sat stiffly in the passenger seat, ears upright, eyes fixed ahead through the windshield. Every few minutes he let out a low, uneasy sound deep in his throat. Ethan glanced at him. "You're acting like we're driving into a minefield." Ranger didn't look at him. That bothered Ethan more than he wanted to admit. By the time they reached the first buildings of Black Hollow, darkness had begun swallowing the valley whole. The town looked frozen in another decade. Old brick storefronts lined a narrow main street coated in slush and snow. Rusted pickup trucks sat parked beneath flickering streetlights. Smoke curled from chimneys into the bitter evening air. A faded mural painted on the side of an old hardware store showed loggers standing beside railroad tracks sometime around 1950. Most of the buildings looked tired, like the town itself had grown old and simply stopped trying. Ethan drove slowly past a grocery store, a shuttered movie theater, and a feed supply building with broken windows covered by plywood. Then he saw the diner Maggie's. The neon sign buzzed weakly in the snowstorm. Ranger suddenly growled. Not loudly, just enough. Ethan looked across the street. A black SUV sat parked beneath a dead street lamp. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. The engine was running. For a moment, Ethan felt the old instinct rise in his chest. The same cold alertness that used to keep men alive overseas. He memorized the license plate automatically. Then the SUV slowly pulled away and disappeared into the falling snow. Ranger kept staring after it. "You saw that too, huh?" The dog's ears twitched. Ethan killed the truck engine outside the diner. For a moment he just sat there, with both hands on the steering wheel, watching warm yellow light glow through the frosted windows. Voices inside, laughter, plates clinking, normal life. Something he hadn't belonged to in a long time. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the windshield. A tired man with haunted eyes. He almost drove away. Then Ranger nudged his arm firmly. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, all right." The bell above the diner door rang the moment they stepped inside. Heat rolled over them immediately, thick with the smell of bacon grease, black coffee, and wood smoke. The diner fell silent, not completely, but enough. Conversation slowed. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Every pair of eyes turned toward Ethan, toward Ranger, toward the Mercer name before he even spoke it. Country music played softly from an old radio near the kitchen. A waitress carrying pie slices stopped moving entirely. Ethan felt Ranger's steps slightly closer against his leg, protective. The diner was small and worn with age, red vinyl booths, old hunting photographs on the walls. A Christmas wreath still hanging crookedly near the register, though the holidays had passed weeks ago. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 60s, wiping down coffee mugs with a white towel. Silver hair, sharp blue eyes, strong hands. She looked at Ethan for a long moment. Long enough to hurt. Then she said quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." Nobody moved. Ethan removed his gloves slowly. "I'm looking for Walter Grayson." The woman's eyes softened just slightly. "You Ethan Mercer?" He nodded once. Something passed through the diner like a ripple through water. One of the old men at the counter lowered his coffee cup carefully. Another whispered softly, "Thomas's boy." The woman behind the counter stepped closer. "My name's Maggie Doyle." Ethan nodded politely. "Walter's expecting you. Law office closes at 6, but he said he'd wait." She looked at Ranger. The old dog watched her carefully. Maggie's expression changed again, almost sadness. "He's beautiful. Retired military," Ethan said. "I can tell." She studied Ethan for another moment before speaking softly. "You got your father's eyes." Ethan looked away immediately. "I wouldn't know." Maggie leaned one hand against the counter. "Yeah," she said quietly. "But none of his piece." That one landed harder than Ethan expected. The diner stayed silent around them, like everyone was listening without pretending not to. Finally, Maggie pointed toward the window at the end of the street. "Walter's office is 2 buildings down." Ethan nodded once. "Appreciate it." Before he turned away, Maggie added softly, "Your father came in here every Thursday for 23 years. Ethan froze. He always sat in the same booth. Silence. Then she said the thing that unsettled him most. "He never stopped waiting for you." Outside, the snow had started falling harder. The wind moved through town, carrying the smell of pine and chimney smoke. Ranger stayed unusually close as they walked toward the law office. The building looked older than everything around it. A narrow brick structure with frosted windows and a brass plaque beside the door. Grayson and Associates. One light still burned upstairs. Ethan climbed the steps slowly. His knees ached in the cold now. Old injuries never stayed quiet during winter. Ranger paused halfway up the stairs and turned suddenly toward the street behind them. Low growl. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. Across the road, the black SUV sat parked again beneath another street lamp, watching. The windshield reflected too much light to see inside. Ethan's pulse slowed automatically. Combat calm. Ranger's fur bristled slightly. Then the SUV drove away once more without headlights. Snow swallowed it almost immediately. The office door opened before Ethan could react further. Warm light spilled onto the porch. An old man stood inside, holding the door open. Thin frame. White hair, wire-rimmed glasses, Walter Grayson. "You came," he said softly. Ethan studied him cautiously. "You sound surprised." Walter smiled faintly. "After all these years?" "Yes." The office smelled like dust, leather, and old paper. Shelves lined every wall. Filing cabinets crowded the corners. A wood stove crackled softly near the back window. Ranger walked through the room slowly, sniffing everything. Then he stopped. His ears lifted sharply. He stared at a closed door near the rear hallway. Walter noticed immediately. "Interesting," he murmured. Ethan frowned. "What?" Walter shook his head lightly. "Nothing. Your father's dog used to do the exact same thing." Ethan stiffened. "My father had a dog?" "A shepherd." "Years ago." Walter removed his coat carefully and sat behind a heavy oak desk. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Ethan remained standing. "Let's just get this over with." Walter nodded slowly. "As you wish." He opened a thick folder tied with faded red string. Inside were maps. property records, old photographs. Walter slid one photograph across the desk. Ethan stared at it. A younger Thomas Mercer stood beside a massive steel hangar deep in the mountains. Snow everywhere. Beside him sat a German shepherd, nearly identical to Ranger. "What is this place?" Ethan asked quietly. "Black Hollow Communications Station." Walter folded his hands, built during the Cold War. Decommissioned sometime in the late 70s. "My father owned this. He bought the surrounding land in 1989. Why?" Walter's eyes drifted briefly toward the window. "He never told anyone." Ethan looked back at the photograph. The hangar looked enormous, dead, haunted somehow. Walter opened another folder. "These are copies of the offers your father received over the years." Ethan skimmed the numbers. 200,000, 400,000, 675,000, all rejected. Every single one. He turned all this down? Yes. Why? Walter hesitated. Then he opened a desk drawer and removed something wrapped carefully in cloth. He placed it on the desk, an iron key dark with age, heavy. Ethan stared at it. "What's this?" "Your father instructed me to give it to you personally." Walter's voice lowered. He said if you ever came here, it meant the land had finally decided to let you in. The room suddenly felt colder. "That doesn't make any sense." "No," Walter agreed softly. "It doesn't." Ranger walked over slowly. The dog lowered his nose to the key. Then something unexpected happened. Ranger whimpered, just once. A low, heartbreaking sound Ethan had never heard before. Walter's face lost color. "My God," the old lawyer whispered. "What?" Walter looked directly at Ethan. "Your father told me something years ago." Ethan waited. Walter swallowed slowly. "He said someday a dog would bring you home." The wind slammed suddenly against the office windows, hard enough to rattle the glass. Ranger turned instantly toward the dark street outside, growling again, this time louder. Ethan stepped toward the window. Far down the street beneath the falling snow, the black SUV had returned, parked motionless at the end of the block. Watching the office, watching them. And for the first time since entering Black Hollow, Ethan realized something deeply unsettling. The town had not been waiting for him alone. Someone else had been waiting too. The black SUV disappeared slowly into the falling snow at the far end of Main Street. Ethan stood motionless beside the office window, watching the taillights fade into darkness between the pine trees beyond town. Ranger remained rigid beside him, low growl, unblinking stare. Walter Grayson quietly closed the blinds. "You should stay at the motel tonight," the old lawyer said carefully. Ethan didn't turn around. "Who was that?" Walter hesitated too long. "That depends on who's driving." Ethan finally looked at him. "I'm not in the mood for riddles." The old man sighed softly and lowered himself into his chair. "Black Hollow is a small town. Small towns collect stories. Most of them should stay buried. And the SUV," Walter folded his hands. "Some people have been interested in your father's land for a very long time. Interested enough to follow strangers?" "Yes." The answer came too fast. That bothered Ethan. Ranger walked to the office door and sat facing it directly, ears alert toward the hallway beyond, like he expected someone else to walk in. Walter noticed. "He really is remarkable. He's a dog." "No," Walter said quietly. "Not just a dog." The room fell silent except for the crackling wood stove. Snow hammered softly against the windows now. The storm outside was growing heavier. Walter reached into another drawer and removed a folded topographic map. He spread it across the desk carefully. "There," he said, pointing toward a section deep in the mountains. "That's the property line." Ethan leaned closer. The valley sat nearly 20 miles outside town, beyond old logging roads and forest service trails. Mountains surrounded it on every side. Isolation, perfect isolation. In another life, Ethan would have called it tactically defensible terrain. Walter tapped a circle drawn in faded red ink. "The structure sits here." "What exactly is it?" "Most folks just call it the hangar." That's not an answer. Walter's expression shifted strangely. It was part of a communications network during the Cold War, built underground and above ground both. Officially abandoned in 1978. Officially, the lawyer looked at him carefully. Your father bought the property 11 years later. Why? I asked him that once. And, Walter looked toward the fire. He said some things should never belong to the government. Silence settled heavily between them. Ethan stared at the map again. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. Too many secrets, too many half-answers, and yet he couldn't walk away, not now. Not after hearing his father might not have abandoned him, after all. Walter rolled the map carefully. You still want to go? Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog had not moved from the doorway, still alert, still listening. Yeah, Ethan said finally. I do, Walter nodded once. The roads will be difficult after dark. I've driven worse. I don't doubt that. The old lawyer stood slowly and handed Ethan the iron key. Up close, the thing looked ancient. Heavy black iron with strange markings worn almost smooth from age. Ethan slipped it into his coat pocket. Cold metal against his chest. Walter walked them to the door. Before Ethan stepped outside, the old man spoke quietly behind him. Your father came to my office every month for 23 years. Ethan paused. He always asked the same question. Ethan turned slightly. What question? Walter's eyes looked older suddenly. Is my boy still alive? The wind hit Ethan the second he stepped outside. Sharp mountain cold. It stole the breath from his lungs instantly. For a moment, he simply stood there beneath the yellow porch light, while snow drifted across the empty street. Ranger pressed close against his leg. The truck started hard, coughing twice before the engine caught. Ethan drove through town slowly. Most lights were already out now. Only Maggie's diner still glowed warm against the storm. As they passed, Ethan noticed Maggie standing alone inside the front window, watching his truck disappear into the mountains, like someone saying goodbye to a ghost. The paved road ended 6 miles outside town. After that came dirt, or what passed for dirt beneath 2 feet of snow. Tall pines crowded the narrow logging trail on both sides. Their branches bent low beneath the storm, creating dark tunnels through the forest. The truck's headlights cut through blowing snow in weak, pale beams. Ranger stayed standing the entire drive, alert. Twice he barked sharply into the darkness beyond the trees. Ethan never saw what triggered it. The farther they climbed, the stranger the forest felt. Too quiet, no birds, no distant engines. Nothing except wind moving through endless trees. Then Ethan saw it. A rusted chain-link fence nearly buried beneath snowdrifts. Military warning signs hung crookedly from the wire. Restricted area, no trespassing. Most of the lettering had faded decades ago. The gate stood open. Ethan slowed the truck. Ranger growled immediately. Not fear, warning, easy, Ethan muttered. The truck rolled forward through the gate. The valley opened suddenly beyond the trees, and there it was. The hangar. Even buried beneath snow and darkness, the structure looked enormous. A massive curved steel building, sitting alone in the middle of the valley, like the skeleton of some dead machine. Rust streaked down the metal sides. Broken floodlights leaned at strange angles. Old communication towers rose from the snow nearby like blackened bones. The place looked abandoned, but not empty. Ethan felt that immediately. Military instincts. Places held energy sometimes. Memory. This place remembered things. Ranger barked sharply. The dog jumped from the truck before Ethan could stop him, and began moving quickly around the perimeter, nose low to the snow, searching, like he'd been here before. Ethan stepped out slowly. The cold punched through his coat instantly. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stared at the giant steel structure looming over the valley. Wind moaned softly through gaps in the metal walls. The sound almost resembled voices. He hated that thought immediately. Hell of a place, he muttered. Ranger disappeared briefly around the side of the hangar. Ethan followed. The flashlight beam swept across. Old crates, collapsed fuel drums, rotted wooden pallets, and strange concrete bunkers half buried beneath snowdrifts. Then he saw Ranger frozen near the far wall. The dog stood perfectly still, staring at the ground. Ethan approached carefully. "What is it?" Ranger pawed once at the snow. Beneath it sat a large steel ventilation grate protruding from the earth. Underground air flowed faintly upward through it. Warm air. Ethan frowned immediately. That wasn't possible. Not after 40 years. He crouched beside the grate and held his hand near the metal. Warm, very faint, but real. Something below ground still had heat. Ranger whined softly. Ethan's pulse slowed automatically. Combat awareness returning. Someone maintaining underground systems? Impossible. Unless the place wasn't abandoned after all. The snowstorm worsened rapidly. Darkness swallowed the valley completely. Ethan decided not to explore further until morning. Inside the hangar, the beam from his flashlight revealed dust-covered equipment frozen in time. Old radio consoles, steel lockers, military filing cabinets. Rows of broken fluorescent lights hanging from the curved ceiling, and silence. A deep, heavy silence. The structure smelled like rust, oil, wet concrete, and something older beneath all of it. The smell of forgotten years. Ethan built a fire inside an old barrel near the center of the hangar. Orange light flickered across the massive, empty interior. Ranger paced constantly, restless. The dog inspected every corner, every doorway, every shadow. Ethan opened an old military ration pack from his duffel bag, while snow hammered the roof overhead. The fire crackled softly. For a little while, exhaustion outweighed fear. Ethan sat against a steel crate wrapped in his coat, while Ranger finally settled nearby. The flames reflected in the dog's tired amber eyes. "You ever think maybe we should kept driving?" Ethan asked quietly. Ranger stared into the darkness behind him. Not at Ethan, at something else. Then the dog stood abruptly, every muscle tensed. A low growl rolled through the hangar. Ethan grabbed the flashlight instantly. "What is it?" Ranger moved fast now, straight toward the far end of the structure, past broken equipment, past old lockers. Then suddenly, bang! The dog slammed both front paws against the concrete floor violently. Ethan rushed after him. "Ranger!" But the shepherd ignored him. Ranger clawed furiously at the floor, barking hard now, teeth bared, paws scraping against the concrete with desperate intensity. The sound echoed through the enormous hangar. "Ranger, stop!" The dog kept digging, claws tearing, breathing hard. Then Ethan heard it. A hollow metallic sound beneath the concrete. His flashlight beam swept downward. Near Ranger's bleeding paws, part of the concrete carried faint welded seams almost invisible beneath decades of dust. Not floor, a hatch, Ranger barked wildly now, and somewhere deep beneath the hangar. Something answered. A faint metallic thud echoed upward through the floor. Ethan froze. The fire crackled softly behind them. The storm screamed outside. And beneath the concrete beneath his boots, someone or something had just moved. Ethan Mercer froze where he stood. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as the metallic echo faded into silence beneath the hangar floor. Ranger barked again, sharp, urgent, not fear, warning. The old German shepherd kept clawing at the welded seams in the concrete until fresh blood streaked across the dusty floor. "Ranger, enough!" Ethan grabbed the dog by the harness and pulled him back. Ranger resisted immediately, muscles rigid, eyes locked on the hidden hatch beneath the concrete. Then, another sound, faint. A metallic clank far below them. Ethan's pulse slowed automatically. Combat calm. His mind began mapping possibilities the same way it used to oversee loose pipes, structural shifts, animals underground. But none of those explanations felt right. Not with warm air coming through the vents. Not with someone watching the property. And not with Ranger acting like this. The dog had saved Ethan's life 3 separate times in Afghanistan. Ranger did not panic without reason. Ethan slowly crouched beside the welded seams. The flashlight beam revealed old tool marks around the edges of the steel plate. Someone had sealed the hatch intentionally years ago, or maybe recently. The fire barrel crackled softly behind them. Outside, the storm hammered the valley harder now. Wind screamed through the broken towers above the hangar roof. Ethan pressed one hand flat against the steel beneath the concrete. Cold. But beneath the cold, vibration. Rhythmic. Something mechanical, still running. A chill crept slowly through his chest. Jesus, Ranger whimpered softly beside him. Then suddenly the old dog stiffened again and turned sharply toward the massive hangar doors, growling low. Ethan killed the flashlight immediately. Darkness swallowed the structure whole, except for the weak orange glow from the fire barrel near the center of the building. Then he heard it too. Crunch, snow outside, footsteps, slow measured, circling the hangar. Ethan moved instantly. Training took over before thought could catch up. He crouched behind an old equipment crate and motioned for Ranger to stay low. The dog obeyed immediately. Another crunch outside. Someone moving carefully through deep snow. Ethan's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The huge hangar doors rattled faintly beneath the wind. Then a beam of light swept briefly across one of the high windows. Flashlight. Someone was outside. Watching the building, Ethan stayed perfectly still. His breathing slowed. His entire body shifted into the same cold awareness he used to feel before raids overseas. The flashlight beam vanished. Silence returned. Then came the sound of an engine starting somewhere beyond the trees. A vehicle pulled away slowly through the storm. The noise faded into the mountains. Ranger finally relaxed slightly. Ethan remained crouched another full minute before standing again. "Not abandoned," he whispered. The words disappeared into the darkness. He looked back toward the hidden hatch beneath the concrete floor. Whatever this place was, people still cared about it. Enough to watch it at night during a blizzard. Enough to scare an entire town into silence. Enough to follow him from the moment he arrived. Ranger returned immediately to the hatch and placed one paw on the welded seam, like he was trying to tell Ethan something. "All right," Ethan muttered. "Tomorrow." The dog stared at him. "Tomorrow," Ethan repeated more firmly. The night passed badly. Ethan barely slept. Every small sound dragged him awake. Wind against metal. Branches scraping the roof. The distant groan of old towers outside. At one point around 3 in the morning, he woke convinced he heard voices whispering somewhere beneath the floor. He sat upright instantly, heart racing. Ranger lifted his head from beside the fire barrel but did not react. No voices, just wind. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face hard. PSD always got worse in unfamiliar places, especially isolated ones. He leaned back against the crate and stared at the curved ceiling disappearing into darkness overhead. His father had owned this place for 30 years. Why? The question circled endlessly through his mind. By dawn, the storm had weakened. Gray mountain light filtered through the dirty upper windows of the hangar. Ranger was already awake, waiting beside the hatch. Of course he was. Ethan stood slowly, joints aching from the cold concrete floor. He heated coffee over the barrel fire, while Ranger paced impatiently near the hidden steel plate. "You're not letting this go, are you?" The dog stopped and stared at him directly. Ethan shook his head. "Fine." He searched the hangar for tools and eventually found an old pry bar beneath collapsed shelving near the rear wall. The steel was rusted but solid. He carried it back toward the hatch. Then the nightmares hit, without warning. One second he stood inside the freezing hangar, the next Kandahar. Heat, smoke, screaming over the radio. The sound of gunfire exploded inside his skull. Ethan staggered backward violently. His breathing turned ragged instantly. His hands shook. No, not now. The hangar, disappeared around him. Afghanistan swallowed everything. Burning vehicles, blood in the dirt, the young corporal screaming for help beneath twisted metal. Ethan dropped the pry bar hard. Metal slammed against concrete, his knees buckled. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The panic attack crashed through him like a wave. Then Ranger was there, immediately. The old shepherd pressed hard against Ethan's chest, forcing him backward against the wall. One paw landed firmly on Ethan's shoulder. Grounding pressure, training. The same thing Ranger used to do after firefights overseas. Easy, Ethan gasped. Ranger pushed harder, steady, calm, unmoving. Ethan focused on the dog's breathing in, out. Slowly the flashbacks loosened their grip. The hangar returned piece by piece, cold air, dust. Rust, snowlight, not Afghanistan, Montana. Ethan sat there against the wall, breathing hard while Ranger stayed pressed against him until the shaking stopped. Finally, Ethan rubbed both hands across the dog's neck. "You saved my ass again," he whispered. Ranger licked his wrist once. A vehicle approached outside. Ethan tensed instantly. This time, it wasn't sneaking. An old truck engine rattled loudly up the snowy road toward the hangar. A few moments later, the large steel doors groaned open slightly. An older man stepped inside carrying a cardboard box. Tall, broad shoulders, gray beard. Vietnam veteran written all over him. The man stopped the moment he saw Ethan. Then his eyes shifted to Ranger. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains a lot." Ethan stayed cautious. "Can I help you?" The old man nodded toward the dog. "That depends. Your shepherd friendly?" Ranger watched him carefully but didn't growl. "Usually." The man set the box down near the fire barrel. "My name's Hank Rawlins." Ethan recognized it immediately. Maggie had mentioned Hank at the diner the night before. "You knew my father." "Knew him damn near 30 years. Hank glanced around the hangar slowly. "Place looks exactly the same. You been here before?" "More times than I can count." Ethan studied him carefully. Hank wore a heavy mechanic's coat, stained with grease and snow. His hands looked thick and scarred from decades of hard labor. But his eyes looked like Ethan's. The eyes of someone who had seen war and never completely left it behind. Hank pointed toward the box. "Brought supplies. Maggie figured you wouldn't have food." Inside sat canned soup, coffee, bread, blankets, and a small first aid kit. Ethan stared at it quietly. People didn't usually help strangers anymore. Not without wanting something. "Why?" Hank shrugged. "Your father would've done the same." Silence settled briefly. Then Hank's gaze shifted toward the hidden hatch in the floor. His expression changed immediately. "You found it." Ethan stiffened. "You know what's down there?" Hank took a long breath. "No. But you know something." The old veteran looked toward the snowy mountains outside. "I know your father came up here every Thursday for over 20 years. For what?" "He never said. Didn't you ask?" Hank gave a tired smile. "Men like your father don't answer questions they don't want answered." Ethan glanced toward Ranger. The dog stood directly beside the hatch again, watching Hank now. Hank noticed the blood on Ranger's paws. "That dog find it?" "Yeah." The old man nodded slowly like that confirmed something important. Then his expression darkened. "You need to be careful up here." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Hank hesitated. Finally, he said quietly, "Because there are folks willing to kill for this land." The hangar suddenly felt colder. "What are you talking about?" "Developers, investors, government people maybe." "Hell if I know." Hank rubbed his jaw. "But every few years somebody shows up trying to buy the valley. And my father refused. Every single time." "Why?" Hank looked directly at Ethan. "Because he was scared of what would happen if the wrong people got inside this place." The wind moaned through the steel walls around them. Ranger growled softly again, this time toward the trees outside. Hank followed the dog's gaze immediately. His face tightened. "You got company." Ethan turned toward the open hangar doors. Far beyond the snow-covered clearing, A truck sat motionless between the trees. No headlights, no movement, just watching the hangar, watching them. Then, slowly, the truck backed deeper into the forest and disappeared. The snow swallowed its tracks almost immediately. Ethan stood motionless near the hangar doors, watching the trees long after the vehicle was gone. Beside him, Ranger remained tense, hackles raised, ears forward, eyes fixed on the woods. Hank Rollins muttered quietly behind them. "That makes 3 times this month." Ethan looked back sharply. "You've seen them before?" Hank nodded once. "Different trucks. Same behavior." "Who are they?" The old veteran rubbed his beard slowly. "Folks around here learned a long time ago not to ask too many questions." "That's not an answer." "No," Hank admitted, "but it's the only one I got." Wind pushed snow into the hangar through the partially opened doors. The steel structure groaned softly overhead. Hank stepped closer to the hidden hatch in the floor. "You planning to open it?" Ethan looked down at the welded seams beneath Ranger's paws. "Yeah." Hank studied him for a moment. Then he nodded toward the pry bar lying nearby. "Well," he said quietly, "might as well find out what your old man spent 30 years protecting." The next 2 hours became work. Hard work. Ethan and Hank dragged old equipment aside while Ranger paced the perimeter restlessly. The steel hatch had been buried beneath layers of concrete patchwork and industrial sealant. Whoever closed it had wanted it hidden forever. Sweat soaked through Ethan's thermal shirt despite the cold. The sharp metallic smell of rust filled the air as the pry bar screeched against welded steel. At one point, Hank paused and looked toward Ethan carefully. "You all right?" Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead. "Why?" "You disappeared for a minute earlier." Ethan knew what he meant. The panic attack. He looked away. Just tired. Hank didn't push. Veterans rarely did. By late afternoon, the final weld cracked loose with a loud metallic snap that echoed through the hangar. Silence followed. Heavy silence. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Ranger immediately stepped forward, tail rigid, breathing fast. Ethan crouched beside the hatch and gripped the rusted steel handle. Cold metal burned against his palm. "You smell that?" Hank muttered quietly. Ethan nodded. Air drifted upward through the opening. Not stale air, fresh air, electricity, oil. Something underground was still alive. Together they pulled. The hatch opened slowly with a deep grinding groan. Darkness waited beneath. A steel ladder descended into blackness far below the hangar floor. Ranger barked sharply into the opening. The sound echoed downward. No response came back. Ethan switched on his flashlight. The beam vanished into darkness beneath them. Hank let out a low whistle. "Well," he murmured, "that ain't normal." Ethan stared downward. His instincts screamed caution, but curiosity had already taken hold. He clipped the flashlight onto his jacket and looked at Ranger. "You stay close." The dog moved instantly to his side. Together they descended. The ladder seemed endless. Metal groaned beneath Ethan's boots as they climbed deeper underground. The temperature changed halfway down. Warmer, drier, artificial. The smell grew stronger too. Old machinery, dust, oil. Then Ethan's boots touched concrete. The flashlight beam swept outward slowly, and Ethan stopped breathing. The underground bunker stretched farther than the hangar itself. Rows of shelves lined the walls. Generators hummed softly somewhere deeper inside. Steel filing cabinets stood locked beneath faded military markings. The place looked frozen in time, like someone had walked out yesterday instead of 40 years ago. Hank climbed down beside him and whispered softly, "Sweet Jesus." The bunker ceiling hung low overhead, packed with old pipes and electrical conduits. Emergency lights glowed dim red along the walls, somehow still functioning after decades underground. Ranger moved carefully through the room, not fearful, focused, like he had finally found what he'd been searching for. Ethan stepped deeper inside. Dust covered everything except one narrow path through the center of the bunker floor. Fresh footprints, Not old. Recent. His pulse slowed instantly. Someone had been down here recently. Hank. The old mechanic saw them too. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Ranger barked once toward the far end of the bunker. Ethan followed. The room opened into a larger chamber beyond, and there, shelves. Hundreds of carefully organized boxes, military supply crates, medical kits, blankets, water purification systems, enough survival gear to support people for months or years. But that wasn't what stopped Ethan cold. It was the wall. Photographs covered nearly the entire far wall, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Ethan moved closer slowly, his throat tightened. Every photograph was of him. Ethan at 18 wearing his Marine ROTC jacket. Ethan graduating Bud CES training. Ethan standing beside his SEAL team overseas. Ethan leaving a courthouse after his divorce. Ethan at his mother's funeral, his entire life, documented, watched. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. "No," he whispered. Hank stared at the wall silently. Ranger walked slowly beneath the photographs, sniffing the air. Ethan stepped closer. Some pictures had dates written carefully beneath them in black ink. Others carried notes. "Proud of you, son. Keep fighting. Still standing." Ethan felt something crack deep inside his chest. He had spent 23 years believing. Thomas Mercer stopped caring after the divorce, after the custody battle, after Ethan's mother turned him against his father. But this was obsession, protection, love. A metal table sat nearby beneath old filing cabinets. On top rested dozens of sealed envelopes tied carefully with faded twine. Each envelope carried Ethan's name written in the same handwriting, his father's handwriting. Letters. Years' worth of letters. Ethan picked one up slowly. The paper shook slightly in his hands. The date on the corner read, March 14, 2006. The year Ethan deployed overseas for the second time. His fingers hesitated before opening it. Then slowly he unfolded the paper. "Son, I heard from Walter that your unit shipped overseas again. I know you probably hate me still. Maybe you always will. But I need you to know something. Every night I pray God brings you home alive. Every single night." Ethan stopped reading. His vision blurred suddenly. The bunker fell silent around him, except for the low hum of generators. Hank quietly turned away to give him privacy. Ranger pressed gently against Ethan's leg. Ethan swallowed hard and opened another letter. This one dated years later. "Son, Walter showed me your wedding photograph today. You looked happy. I haven't seen that in your eyes since you were a little boy fishing beside Flathead Lake. I hope she's kind to you. I hope you build something peaceful together. You deserve peace more than you know." Ethan shut his eyes hard, his chest hurt. Not from anger, from grief. All those years, all those wasted years. He looked at the photographs again. His father had followed his entire life from a distance, silently, without ever reaching out. Why? That question burned hotter now than ever. Ranger suddenly barked sharply near the rear wall. Ethan wiped quickly at his eyes and turned. The old shepherd stood beside a tall steel cabinet, hidden behind old radio equipment. Unlike everything else in the bunker, this cabinet looked newer, recently maintained. A heavy lock secured the front. Ranger pawed at it immediately. Ethan approached slowly. The lock carried no rust at all. Someone opened this cabinet regularly, very recently. Hank stepped beside him quietly. "You think that's what they're after?" Ethan touched the cold steel carefully. "I think this place isn't dead." The air suddenly shifted. A distant metallic sound echoed somewhere above them. Both men froze. Footsteps. Inside the hangar overhead, Ranger growled instantly. Low, dangerous. Ethan killed the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the bunker. Then came another sound above them. A slow scraping noise across the hangar floor. Someone was upstairs. And this time, they weren't hiding it. The footsteps above the bunker moved slowly across the hangar floor. Heavy boots. Deliberate. Ethan stood frozen in the darkness beneath the steel hatch while Ranger's growl deepened beside him. Hank Rollins quietly reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt, but didn't turn it on. Nobody spoke. Another scrape echoed overhead. Closer now. Someone was inside the hangar. Ethan's pulse settled into the same cold rhythm he used to feel before operations overseas. The years fell away in moments like this. Training buried itself deep inside a man. Even age couldn't kill it completely. He leaned close to Hank. How many? Shook his head slightly. Could be one. Could be more. Ranger suddenly looked upward and barked sharply. Then silence. Absolute silence. The footsteps stopped. Ethan stared toward the ladder, leading back up to the hatch. Waiting. The bunker hummed softly around them. Generators. Ventilation systems. Ghosts of old machinery still breathing beneath the mountain. Then, bang. Something heavy slammed against the hangar floor overhead. Ranger lunged toward the ladder instantly. Easy, Ethan whispered. Another bang followed. Metal shifting. Someone was moving equipment upstairs, searching. Ethan made a decision quickly. Stay here, he whispered to Hank. The hell I will. You got a weapon? Hank's silence answered for him. Ethan nodded once. Then stay here. He moved toward the ladder. Ranger stayed pressed against his leg every step of the way. Slowly, Ethan climbed upward into darkness. The hatch opening revealed faint gray light from the storm outside, filtering through the hangar windows. The fire barrel had nearly died out. The giant structure looked empty at first. Then Ethan saw movement near the far wall. A flashlight beam swept briefly across the old radio equipment. One person, maybe two, dressed in dark winter coats, searching quickly. Ethan stayed low behind the hatch opening, while Ranger crouched beside him silently. The men spoke in low voices too far away to understand clearly. One of them kicked aside an old crate. Another scanned the floor near where the hatch had been hidden, looking for it. Ethan's jaw tightened. Whoever they were, they knew something existed beneath the hangar. Then Ranger's muscles suddenly tensed hard beneath Ethan's hand. The dog stared toward the hangar entrance. Ethan followed his gaze. The black SUV from town sat outside beyond the snow-covered clearing, engine running, headlights off. A third man leaned casually against the hood, smoking a cigarette. Watching the hangar, watching the search, Ethan slowly exhaled. Not random trespassers, organized. The searchers moved closer toward the hatch. Ranger gave a faint warning growl. Too loud. One of the men stopped instantly. The flashlight beam snapped toward the hatch opening. Who's there? Ethan moved immediately. He shoved the hatch closed hard from below. The steel slammed shut overhead. A curse echoed from the hangar floor above. Then footsteps rushed toward the hatch. Move! Ethan barked. Hank was already climbing the bunker ladder toward the deeper chambers. Ranger stayed directly beside Ethan as he descended quickly behind him. The steel hatch rattled violently above them, someone trying to force it open. Ethan grabbed a thick locking wheel, mounted beside the ladder, and spun it hard. Deep steel bolts slammed into place. The hatch stopped moving instantly. Silence followed. Then muffled shouting overhead. One of the intruders kicked the hatch repeatedly. The sound echoed through the bunker. Hank looked pale. They know now. Yeah. Ranger kept staring upward. Ready. Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly. Think. The bunker had power, ventilation, supplies, maybe another exit too. Military installations always had backup routes. He grabbed the flashlight again and swept the beam across the walls. Maps, equipment, storage rooms. Then something caught his eye near the rear chamber. Cassette tapes. Dozens of them. Carefully labeled in black marker. Thomas Mercer, personal recordings. Ethan stared at them. His father's voice, preserved underground for decades. The banging above them slowly stopped. Then came the sound of engines outside. Vehicles leaving or repositioning. Ranger's ears twitched constantly, tracking every vibration. They'll come back, Hank said quietly. Ethan nodded. Yeah, the old veteran looked around the bunker. You know what this means? Ethan didn't answer. Hank stepped closer. Your father wasn't hiding from people. He was hiding something from them. The words settled heavily in the bunker air. Ethan picked up one of the tapes slowly. Dust coated the plastic case. The label read, "For Ethan, if he ever comes home." His throat tightened immediately. The bunker suddenly felt too small, too personal, too full of things he had spent 23 years trying not to feel. Ranger nudged his hand gently. Ethan swallowed hard and looked toward an old tape player sitting beside the shelves. Still plugged in, still working, he inserted the tape slowly. The machine clicked. Static filled the bunker softly. Then a voice, older, rougher, tired, Thomas Mercer. Ethan hadn't heard his father's voice in over 2 decades. It hit him harder than gunfire ever had. "If you're hearing this," the recording said quietly. Then Ranger found the hatch. Ethan froze. Hank looked at him sharply. The tape crackled softly. "I figured he would." Ethan stared at the speaker. Ranger sat down slowly beside him, ears lifted toward the sound of the dead man's voice. "He always had better instincts than people," Thomas continued, "just like his father did." Ethan looked down at Ranger. Father. The shepherd from the old photograph upstairs. Thomas's dog. The resemblance suddenly made sense. "I don't know how old you are when you find this," the recording continued. "Maybe you still hate me. Maybe you should." The bunker hummed softly around them. Snow rattled faintly through distant vents overhead. Then Thomas spoke again. "The truth starts with your sister." Ethan's chest tightened instantly. His younger sister Claire, 6 years old, dead before Ethan turned 12. He remembered almost nothing about the months after her death, except screaming and broken dishes and his mother crying herself sick at night. Thomas's voice grew quieter on the tape. "After Claire died, your mother changed. Grief can hollow a person out until there's nothing left inside but pain." Ethan closed his eyes slowly. Old memories surfaced immediately. His mother locking herself in dark rooms. His father sleeping on the couch. Police lights outside the house one winter night. "We tried," Thomas said softly. "God knows we tried." The recording crackled. She started drinking. Then came the pills. Then came the rage. Hank looked away respectfully. Ethan remained perfectly still. "One night," Thomas continued, "she threw a lamp at you during one of the fights. You were 13. Ethan's breathing slowed. A memory flashed suddenly. Glass exploding beside his head. His father pulling him backward. Blood on the kitchen floor. "She didn't mean to hurt you," Thomas whispered through the tape. "But she was drowning." The bunker suddenly felt colder. Ranger pressed quietly against Ethan's leg again. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "She made me promise to leave." Ethan opened his eyes. The tape hissed softly. "She said if I stayed, she'd destroy both of us. And son." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "I believed her." Silence filled the bunker. Ethan stared at nothing all those years. All that hatred, built on half a story. "I agreed to stay away during the custody hearings," Thomas continued quietly. "I thought maybe distance would give you a chance at a normal life." Ethan let out a faint broken laugh. Normal. There had never been anything normal about his life after that. "She made me swear not to contact you directly," Thomas said. "And I kept that promise every single day. Not because I stopped loving you, because I loved you enough to let you hate me." The words hit Ethan like a punch. Ranger rested his head slowly against Ethan's knee. The tape kept playing. "I followed your deployments through Walter and some old Navy friends. I knew every time you got hurt, every time you came home." Ethan's eyes burned suddenly. "I saw your wedding picture in the paper," Thomas whispered. "You looked happy. I remember praying maybe the war inside you had finally stopped." The bunker blurred slightly around Ethan. Hank quietly walked farther away to give him privacy. Then Thomas's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "But lately, people have been asking questions about the valley again." Ethan looked up sharply. If you're hearing this recording, then they've probably started searching already. The tape crackled loudly, and above them, somewhere in the storm-dark hangar, Ranger suddenly sprang to his feet, barking furiously into the darkness. Someone was moving overhead again. The sound above the bunker came fast this time. Heavy boots, metal scraping, voices, not hiding anymore. Ethan killed the tape recorder instantly. Silence crashed through the underground chamber, except for Ranger's barking and the low hum of the generators. Hank looked pale beneath the bunker lights. They found the hatch. Ethan was already moving. He grabbed the flashlight and scanned the room quickly, mind shifting into combat rhythm. Entrances, exits, cover points, military habits returned faster than breathing. Any other way out, he asked. Hank shook his head. Not that I know of. Above them, metal slammed loudly against the hatch wheel. Someone trying to force it open. Ranger growled so deeply Ethan felt it through the floor. Then came a voice overhead, muffled but clear enough. Search the lower rooms, plural. More than one man. Ethan's jaw tightened. The hidden cabinet behind the radio equipment suddenly mattered a whole lot more. He moved toward it quickly. The lock resisted, at first, before finally snapping beneath the pry bar. The cabinet door creaked open. Inside sat rows of old military files bound in black straps. Cassette tapes, hard drives, photographs, and one thick red folder marked Project Winterkeep. Even Hank reacted to that name. Oh no. Ethan looked at him sharply. You know this? Hank rubbed one trembling hand across his beard. I heard rumors back in the 80s. Some kind of military testing program. What kind of testing? The old veteran didn't answer immediately. Above them, the hatch groaned violently. One of the intruders shouted something. Metal shrieked. They said it was for combat stress, Hank whispered finally. Experimental treatments for soldiers coming home messed up from war. Ethan stared at him. Pitts did. The word sat unspoken between them. They used veterans? Ethan asked quietly. Hank nodded once. Supposedly. Ranger barked hard toward the ladder again. The steel bolts on the hatch rattled violently now. The men upstairs were getting closer. Ethan opened the red folder quickly. Inside were photographs, military hospitals, men strapped to medical beds, injection reports, psychological evaluations. Then he saw the dates and signatures, government officials, defense contractors. One name appeared repeatedly. Clayton Biotech Industries. Ethan frowned. Clayton. Hank's expression darkened. Clayton Voss. The name landed heavily. Maggie had mentioned him earlier in town. Wealthy developer. Owned half the commercial property near Black Hollow now. His family funded the experiments, Hank said quietly. At least that's what people whispered. Ethan flipped through more pages, then froze. One photograph showed a young Thomas Mercer standing beside another soldier in front of the communications hangar. Thomas looked furious. The other man held medical files under one arm. Written on the back in faded ink, "We tried to stop them." Ethan's chest tightened. His father hadn't just hidden here. He had been protecting evidence. A loud metallic bang exploded overhead. One of the hatch bolts snapped loose. Ranger lunged toward the ladder, barking wildly. "Damn it," Hank muttered. Ethan grabbed the folder, tapes, and hard drives quickly and stuffed them into an old military duffel bag nearby. The hatch above them groaned again. Almost open now. Then, a calm voice echoed faintly through the steel. "Mr. Mercer?" Ethan froze instantly. Not shouting, not angry. "Polite Mr. Mercer," the voice repeated. "My name is Clayton Voss. I think we should talk." Hank whispered a curse under his breath. Ranger's teeth showed fully now. Ethan stepped closer beneath the hatch but kept his distance. "What do you want?" A pause. Then the voice above answered calmly. "To save you a great deal of trouble." Snow hissed faintly through the hangar somewhere overhead. Ethan looked at Hank. The old veteran mouthed silently. "Don't trust him. No chance of that." Clayton spoke again. You found something underground that doesn't belong to you. Ethan's grip tightened around the duffel strap. My father left it to me. Your father stole federal property. That's so, yes. The calm voice never changed. That bunker contains classified materials tied to national defense contracts. Ethan almost laughed. Funny way to describe drugging veterans. Silence followed, long enough to matter. Then Clayton spoke again, quieter this time. Your father was unstable near the end. Ranger barked furiously. Ethan's eyes hardened instantly. No, he said coldly. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Above them, boots shifted across the hatch. At least 3 men, maybe more, Clayton sighed softly. Mr. Mercer, I can make this easy. Walk away from the property and nobody gets hurt. That sentence changed everything. Not negotiation, threat. Ethan stepped closer beneath the hatch. You threaten me again, he said evenly, and this conversation changes. Silence. Then Clayton laughed quietly. Not nervous, confident. You really are Thomas Mercer's son. The hatch bolts groaned again. One final lock remained. Ethan's mind moved quickly now. They couldn't hold the bunker forever. And if Clayton had enough influence to bury military experiments for decades, he had enough influence to bury Ethan too. Ranger suddenly stopped barking. The dog tilted his head sharply toward the rear wall of the bunker, listening. Then, without warning, he sprinted away from the hatch. Ethan followed immediately. Ranger. The shepherd ran deep into the rear chambers beyond the storage shelves. His claws scraped hard against concrete as he disappeared around a narrow corner. Then Ethan saw it. Another tunnel, half hidden behind stacked supply crates. How the hell? Hank stared in disbelief. The tunnel stretched into darkness beneath the mountain. Emergency escape route. Military standard. Ranger barked from inside the tunnel impatiently. Smart dog. Very smart dog. The hatch above them slammed violently. One final bolt snapped loose. Ethan looked at Hank. We move now. The old veteran nodded immediately. Together they disappeared into the tunnel, just as the hatch above finally burst open. Voices exploded through the bunker behind them. Clear the lower level. Flashlights swept wildly through the darkness. Ranger led them deeper underground at a fast pace. The tunnel air smelled damp and ancient. Water dripped from overhead pipes. Emergency lights flickered weakly every few yards. Behind them, the searchers spread through the bunker. One shouted, "The files are gone." Another, "Find them." Ethan moved faster. Years of combat training returned completely now. Fear narrowed into focus. Protect the evidence. Protect the dog. Survive. The tunnel climbed upward slowly beneath the mountain. After several minutes, they reached a rusted steel door hidden behind tangled roots and snow outside the valley, nearly half a mile from the hangar. Cold air rushed inside when Ethan forced it open. Night had fallen completely. Snow hammered the forest. Ranger emerged first, immediately scanning the trees. Hank bent over, breathing hard. "They're gonna burn that place," he said. Ethan looked back toward the valley through the trees. Faint lights moved around the hangar below. Flashlights, vehicles, men searching. Then Ethan saw something else. Clayton Voss himself, stepping from the black SUV. Even from this distance, the man looked expensive. Long dark coat, gray hair, calm posture. The kind of man used to controlling rooms, used to controlling people. Clayton stood outside the hangar staring directly toward the forest, toward Ethan, as though he somehow knew exactly where he was hiding. Then slowly, Clayton smiled. The sight sent cold anger through Ethan's chest. Ranger growled low beside him. "Yeah," Ethan whispered to the dog. "I don't like him either." Hank stepped closer carefully. "You need to leave Black Hollow tonight." Ethan shook his head immediately. "No, son, no." The word came harder this time. Ethan looked down at the duffel bag full of evidence, at his father's tapes, at the photographs covering decades of lies. All those years thinking Thomas Mercer walked away because he stopped caring. All those wasted years, and underneath it all, a hidden war nobody wanted uncovered. Ethan looked back toward the valley again. The hangar lights glowed faintly through the storm like some wounded animal surrounded by hunters. Ranger pressed against his leg quietly, steady, loyal, ready. Ethan took a long breath of freezing mountain air. Then he said the one thing that surprised even himself. "I'm not leaving my father behind again." The words hung in the freezing air between the trees. Hank Rollins studied Ethan for a long moment beneath the falling snow. Then the old mechanic nodded once. "Guess that settles it." Below them, lights still moved around the hangar in the valley. Flashlights swept across the steel walls like hunting beams. Trucks crawled slowly through the snow-covered clearing, searching, waiting. Ranger stood rigid beside Ethan, staring toward the property with the same focus he once carried during patrols overseas. The old shepherd looked tired now, older than Ethan wanted to admit. Snow clung to the gray fur around his muzzle, but his eyes still burned sharp and alert. Still a working dog at heart, still protecting his soldier. Ethan adjusted the duffel bag over his shoulder. "We need somewhere safe." Hank rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "There's an old ranger cabin north of the ridge. Nobody uses it anymore except hunters during elk season." "You trust it?" "I trust the weather to keep most people away." That was good enough. The climb through the forest took nearly 2 hours. Snow deepened higher up the mountain. Wind tore through the pine trees hard enough to shake loose, heavy curtains of ice. The trail barely existed anymore, more memory than road. Hank led the way with an old lantern, while Ethan followed behind with Ranger close at his side. The dog limped slightly now. Ethan noticed it halfway through the climb. "Hold up." They stopped beneath a cluster of frozen pines. Ranger sat immediately when Ethan knelt beside him. Blood stained the fur along his front paw. The cuts from digging through concrete earlier had reopened. Damn it. Ethan carefully cleaned the paw using supplies from Hank's first aid kit, while Ranger remained perfectly still. "You should've told me," Ethan muttered quietly. Ranger only watched him calmly, the same way he always had, trusting completely. Hank leaned against a tree nearby, watching silently. "You know," the old veteran said after a moment, "Thomas talked about that dog sometimes." Ethan looked up sharply. "My father knew Ranger?" "Not this Ranger," Hank smiled faintly. "His father." Ethan paused. "The shepherd from the photograph." "Yeah." Snow drifted softly between the trees around them. Hank's expression softened with memory. "Your old man raised military dogs for years after Vietnam. Mostly retired working dogs nobody wanted anymore." Ethan stared at him. "He never told me that." "Wasn't much chance for him to tell you anything." The words landed heavier than Hank probably intended. Ethan looked back down at Ranger's injured paw. His father had spent decades protecting broken dogs. Broken veterans too, apparently. Maybe broken things simply recognized each other. They reached the Ranger cabin near midnight. The structure sat alone against the mountainside, beneath towering pine trees bent heavy with snow. One small porch, stone chimney, roof half buried beneath drifts, but it was dry and hidden. Hank got the wood stove running, while Ethan unpacked the duffel bag onto an old table near the firelight. Files, photographs, cassette tapes, secrets buried underground for 40 years. Ranger collapsed heavily beside the stove almost immediately, exhausted. Ethan sat beside him and carefully checked the dog's shoulder harness. That's when he saw the blood. Not from the paw, fresh, lower shoulder, knife cut, shallow but ugly. Ethan frowned immediately. "When did this happen?" Ranger lifted his head weakly. "The cut must have happened during the escape through the bunker." Ethan hadn't noticed in the chaos. Guilt hit him hard. He cleaned the wound carefully while Ranger endured it without a sound. Outside, wind hammered against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled softly. For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, Ethan finally allowed himself to stop moving. And once he stopped, the emotions caught him. His father's voice, the photographs, the letters. All those years believing he'd been abandoned. All wrong. He sat heavily on the floor beside Ranger and stared into the fire. Hank poured coffee quietly from an old tin pot. "You all right?" Ethan laughed once under his breath. "No." The honesty surprised both of them. Hank handed him the coffee. "Good," the old man said. "Means you're still human." For a while neither man spoke. The storm filled the silence instead. Then Ethan reached for another cassette tape. This one was labeled Winterkeep, Final Record. He slid it into the tape player slowly. Static crackled. Then Thomas Mercer's voice returned through the tiny speaker. "If this tape is playing," Thomas said quietly, "then either I'm dead, or Clayton Voss finally came looking for what we buried." Hank sat up straighter immediately. Ethan leaned closer. The tape hissed softly beneath the firelight. "In 1981, Thomas continued, a group of us stationed at Black Hollow intercepted military reports tied to psychological testing on returning combat veterans." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Officially," Thomas said, "they called it adaptive neurological conditioning." Hank muttered quietly, "Jesus Christ." "Unofficially," Thomas continued, "they were experimenting on damaged soldiers." The cabin felt suddenly smaller. Thomas's voice grew rougher. Men came home from war, carrying trauma nobody understood yet. PTSD wasn't treated back then. It was hidden. The tape crackled again. So they tested chemical therapies, sleep deprivation, sensory conditioning. Ethan stared at the speaker in silence. "They said it would help soldiers reintegrate," Thomas whispered. "Some men got worse. Some disappeared entirely." Hank slowly removed his glasses. "My God," Thomas continued. "A small group of us gathered evidence intending to expose the operation. Then people started dying. The wind screamed against the cabin walls outside. Accidents, suicides, disappearances." Thomas paused for several seconds before speaking again. "We realized somebody powerful wanted the entire operation erased." Ethan's hands tightened around the coffee cup. "So we buried the evidence beneath Black Hollow." The fire popped sharply. "Not for revenge," Thomas said. "For protection. Because someday somebody would need proof." Ethan looked toward the files spread across the table. "Proof," the tape continued. "Clayton Voss's father funded the program through private defense contracts. When the operation collapsed, the Voss family spent decades buying silence." Hank nodded slowly, like old rumors finally made sense. "But the most important thing," Thomas said quietly, "is this." His voice softened. "The land was never meant to make you rich, Ethan." Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. The tape hissed softly. "It was meant to save people like us." Silence filled the cabin. Then Thomas continued carefully. "When I came home from Vietnam, nobody knew what to do with broken soldiers. Men drank themselves to death, slept under bridges, lost their families." Ethan stared into the fire because he understood every word. "I built Black Hollow to become a refuge someday," Thomas whispered. "Cabins, workshops, land for retired military dogs." Ranger lifted his head slowly at the sound of Thomas's voice. "I figured maybe wounded men heal better beside wounded animals." Ethan's throat tightened painfully. The tape crackled. "I hoped someday you might understand that." Outside, something snapped loudly in the woods. Ranger exploded to his feet, barking furiously toward the cabin door. Every muscle in Ethan's body locked instantly. Headlights swept suddenly through the trees outside. Multiple vehicles coming fast. Hank went pale. "No." Truck engines growled through the storm below the ridge. They had been followed. Ranger's barking deepened into full combat aggression now. Then through the blizzard outside, a voice echoed faintly across the mountain. "Mr. Mercer, Clayton Voss." Even through the storm his voice sounded calm, controlled, certain. "We know you're in there." Ethan stood slowly beside the fire. His PST pulsed hard beneath his ribs now. The old combat instincts, the fear, the adrenaline. But underneath all of it, something else had started growing. Purpose. He looked down at Ranger standing beside him despite the bleeding shoulder. Old, scarred, still fighting. Then Ethan reached slowly beneath the table and pulled free the rifle Hank had quietly left there earlier. The mountain storm howled outside the cabin, and for the first time in many years, Ethan Mercer stopped running. The rifle felt cold and familiar in his hands. Not comforting, never comforting, just necessary. Outside the ranger cabin, headlights glowed through the blizzard like pale ghosts moving between the trees. Snow whipped sideways across the mountainside, hard enough to erase shapes and distance. Clayton Voss's men were spreading out, methodical, disciplined, not random hired muscle. Ranger stood at the cabin door, growling low, every muscle tense, despite the blood staining the fur along his shoulder. Hank Rollins quietly loaded shells into an old shotgun beside the stove. "You still shoot straight?" Ethan asked without looking at him. Hank snorted once. "Son, I was old when disco was popular. Doesn't mean I forgot Vietnam." Another voice echoed outside through the storm. "Mr. Mercer," Clayton again, calm as ever. "We're not here to hurt you." Ethan almost smiled at that. People who said those words usually meant the opposite. The cabin windows rattled violently under the wind. Then Ranger barked sharply toward the rear wall. Not the front, the back. Ethan moved instantly. A shadow flashed past the snow-covered rear window. One of the men trying to circle behind the cabin. Ethan killed the lantern nearest the wall, plunging half the room into darkness. "Back entrance," he whispered. Hank nodded and moved toward the side window. Outside, boots crunched through deep snow. Then came another sound. Engines, more than before. Ethan peered carefully through a crack in the curtain. 3 trucks now, and beyond them, the storm itself was worsening. The sky had turned nearly black despite the early hour. Snow swirled so thick the mountains beyond the trees had vanished completely. A real blizzard. The kind that trapped people, killed people. Clayton knew it too. That's why he came tonight. No witnesses, no roads, no escape. Ranger barked again, then glass shattered. A man crashed through the rear window, trying to force his way inside. Ranger hit him before his boots touched the floor. The old shepherd launched through the darkness with terrifying speed, slamming the intruder backward into the kitchen table. The man screamed. Furniture crashed. Ethan moved instantly, ripping the rifle from the man's hands before he could recover. Another figure appeared outside the broken window. Hank fired once into the ceiling beams above him. Wood exploded downward. The second intruder stumbled backward into the storm. "Enough!" Hank roared. For one brief moment, silence returned except for the wind. The intruder beneath Ranger groaned weakly on the floor, hands raised. Ranger stood over him, growling hard enough to vibrate through the cabin. Ethan looked down coldly. The man couldn't have been older than 30. Expensive winter gear, professional boots, fear in his eyes now. "Who sent you?" Ethan demanded. The man glanced toward the storm outside. Didn't answer. Ranger growled louder. "All right," the man gasped. "Voss, no surprise there. What does he want?" The man hesitated too long, then quietly. "The drives." Ethan's pulse slowed. "The evidence." "They're terrified those files survived," the man whispered quickly. "You don't understand what's on them. I'm starting to." Outside, an engine revved loudly. Headlights shifted through the snow. Then Clayton's voice echoed again from somewhere near the trucks. "Ethan. First name now, personal. I know you found the bunker recordings." Ethan looked toward the storm. "You should listen carefully to the rest of them." The wind howled harder between the trees. "You think your father was protecting veterans," Clayton called out. But he was protecting himself. Rage flickered inside Ethan immediately. Ranger sensed it too. The shepherd looked back toward him briefly, grounding him, keeping him steady. Ethan stepped carefully toward the front door, but stayed behind cover. "What are you talking about?" Clayton's voice remained calm. Thomas Mercer wasn't just a witness. He helped build Winterkeep. The words hit hard. Hank looked stunned. "That's a lie," the old mechanic muttered. Outside, Clayton continued. "Your father participated in the early stages before he turned against the project." Snow swirled violently through the headlights now. "He wasn't innocent, Ethan." Silence filled the cabin. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. Not because he believed Clayton completely, because part of him feared it might be true. The tape recordings, the military photographs, Thomas standing beside those men. His father had hidden things, a lot of things. Then Clayton spoke again. "Bring me the drives and you walk away alive," Ranger barked furiously. The intruder on the floor tried suddenly to reach for a hidden pistol beneath his coat. Big mistake. Ranger lunged instantly. The man cried out as the shepherd slammed him flat against the floorboards again, teeth inches from his throat. "Don't," Ethan said quietly. The intruder froze completely. Ranger remained over him, growling. The old dog's body trembled now from exhaustion and blood loss. Ethan saw it clearly. Ranger was pushing past his limits, just like always. The storm outside intensified even more. Tree branches cracked somewhere down the mountainside. Visibility disappeared almost completely beyond the trucks. Then Hank suddenly looked toward the radio sitting near the stove. Static crackled through it. A weather alert. Historic blizzard warning. Road closures across the valley. Emergency shelter orders for Black Hollow residents. Hank looked at Ethan grimly. "Nobody's getting off this mountain tonight." Which meant Clayton and his men were trapped too. That changed things completely. Then Ethan realized something worse. Black Hollow itself sat vulnerable beneath the storm. Maggie, Walter, the townspeople. If Clayton became desperate enough, he could use them. Ethan looked toward the evidence bag sitting beside the stove. His father had spent decades protecting the truth. But Thomas Mercer's real dream wasn't revenge. It was sanctuary, a place for damaged people to survive. And now the storm had trapped everyone inside the valley together. Hunters, victims, veterans, ghosts. Ranger suddenly moved away from the captured intruder and limped toward the window again, alert, listening. Then Ethan heard it too, snowmobiles. Multiple engines approaching from farther down the ridge. Fast. Headlights emerged through the blizzard below. Not Clayton's trucks. Different. Hank stepped closer to the window and let out a stunned breath. "Well, I'll be damned." The first snowmobile stopped outside the cabin. Then another, and another. Black Hollow townspeople climbed off, carrying rifles, blankets, fuel cans, and supplies. Maggie Doyle stepped forward, first wrapped in a heavy winter coat, shotgun slung over one shoulder. Behind her came Walter Grayson, 3 ranchers from town, the postmaster, and even old Reverend Pike from the church. The storm roared around them. Maggie looked toward Ethan through the shattered doorway. "You really thought you were fighting this alone?" For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, something warm cracked through the ice inside Ethan Mercer's chest. Community, not pity, not charity, family. Outside near the trucks, Clayton Voss watched the townspeople arrive with visible irritation. The balance had shifted, and everyone on the mountain knew it. Maggie stepped into the cabin, took one look at Ranger's bloody shoulder, and immediately knelt beside the dog. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered softly. Ranger's tail moved weakly once against the floorboards. Hank glanced toward Ethan. "You know what this means now?" Ethan looked out toward the storm, swallowing Black Hollow whole. Clayton still stood beside his SUV, watching the cabin carefully. Patient, dangerous, waiting. Then Ethan finally understood something his father must have realized years ago. The valley itself wasn't the inheritance. The people were. And now every one of them was trapped inside the storm together. The blizzard swallowed Black Hollow by midnight. Roads vanished beneath 6-foot drifts. Power lines snapped across the valley. The mountain disappeared behind walls of white. Inside the ranger cabin, the townspeople moved quickly and quietly, like people who understood storms and fear both. Maggie Doyle boiled coffee over the stove, while Walter Grayson sorted through old radios searching for a signal. Hank reinforced the shattered rear window with plywood scavenged from the shed outside, and Ethan sat beside Ranger. The old shepherd rested near the fire, wrapped in blankets while snow hissed against the cabin walls. The knife wound in Ranger's shoulder looked worse now, angry, swollen. Still, the dog refused to rest completely. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the storm outside, listening, guarding, always guarding. Maggie knelt beside Ethan, holding a clean cloth. "He needs stitches. I know. There's a veterinarian in town. No roads. We've crossed worse." Ethan looked at her carefully. This woman barely knew him, yet here she was risking her life for his dog. For him. Why? Maggie seemed to understand the question without hearing it. "Your father fixed my roof after my husband died," she said softly while cleaning blood from Ranger's fur. "Never charged me a dime." Ranger lifted his head weakly as she worked. Maggie smiled gently. "He also brought soup every winter to old people too stubborn to ask for help." Walter glanced up from the radio. "Built half the wheelchair ramps in town himself," Hank snorted softly, "and cursed the entire time he did it." A few tired laughs moved through the cabin. Small sounds. Human sounds. The kind Ethan hadn't heard around himself in years. The warmth of it hurt somehow, because he realized how much of life he'd spent alone. Outside, engines growled faintly through the storm again. Every conversation stopped instantly. Ranger rose despite the pain, growling. Headlights appeared beyond the snow-covered trees. Closer now. Clayton Voss wasn't leaving. Walter cursed quietly under his breath. "They're cutting off the lower ridge." Ethan moved to the window carefully. Through the white chaos outside, he counted at least 5 armed men moving around the mountainside. Organized perimeter, containment, military style. "They're trapping us," Hank muttered. "No," Ethan said quietly. "They're trapping the evidence." He looked toward the duffel bag near the fire. Everything revolved around those files now. The tapes, the drives, the proof. Thomas Mercer had hidden a secret powerful enough to terrify wealthy men 40 years later. And now Ethan understood something else, too. Clayton wasn't desperate because the evidence existed. He was desperate because it was about to survive. A loud crack split the night outside. Gunfire. Everyone flinched. Then another shot echoed through the mountains. Ranger barked furiously. The radio on Walter's table burst suddenly into static. A frightened voice crackled through. "Walter? Walter, can you hear me?" Maggie rushed over. "Donna?" The gas station owner's voice shook badly through the static. "They're at the diner." Silence hit the cabin hard. Walter grabbed the radio. "Who's at the diner?" "Voss's men," Donna whispered. "They're searching buildings." Ethan's pulse slowed immediately. The storm had become cover. Now Clayton was trying to find the evidence before authorities could reach the valley. "They took the sheriff's truck," Donna continued. "Said nobody leaves town until morning." Maggie's face hardened instantly. That son of a bitch. Outside, wind screamed harder through the mountains. Then Donna's voice cracked again through static. "They're heading toward the church next." The radio died. Silence filled the cabin. Hank looked at Ethan carefully. "What now, Seal?" The old nickname landed strangely. Ethan looked around the room. At Maggie, Walter, the exhausted townspeople. At Ranger struggling to stand beside him despite the blood loss. His PSD pulsed hard now beneath his ribs. The pressure, the storm, the threat closing in from all sides. Part of him wanted to disappear into the mountains alone. Run. That instinct had ruled his life for years. But another part, the part Thomas Mercer apparently passed down to him, refused. He looked down at Ranger. The dog held his gaze steadily. trusting him completely. Ethan finally stood. "We move everyone to the hangar." Walter blinked. "The hangar? It's defensible." Hank nodded slowly. "He's right. There's underground shelter," Ethan continued. "Supplies. Reinforced walls." Maggie stared toward the storm outside. "In this weather," Ethan looked at the mountains. "At least there we choose the battlefield." Nobody argued after that. The convoy moved before dawn. Snowmobiles, trucks, people wrapped in blankets and heavy coats. The storm nearly erased the world around them. Visibility dropped so low Ethan sometimes navigated only by memory and instinct. Ranger rode beside him in the truck cab, trembling from pain but refusing to lie down. Twice Ethan reached over to steady the old dog during the rough mountain climb. "You hang in there," he whispered quietly. Ranger pressed weakly against his arm. The hangar emerged through the blizzard like a giant steel ghost waiting in the valley. Floodlights from Clayton's vehicles glowed nearby through curtains of snow. The men guarding the property scattered immediately when they saw the convoy approaching. Not expecting resistance, definitely not expecting the entire town. Ethan moved fast, SEAL instincts fully awake now. Barricade the east doors. Keep everyone inside. Lights low. People obeyed automatically, because fear recognizes leadership faster than anything else. Inside the hangar, the old bunker generators still hummed beneath the floor. Warmth spread slowly through the giant steel structure once the systems powered up fully. Families huddled near makeshift fires. Blankets covered children. Coffee boiled in military cookpots, scavenged from storage. And beneath it all, the bunker remained hidden, protected for now. Ranger collapsed finally near the central fire barrel, breathing hard. Maggie examined the wound again. Her face tightened immediately. Infection setting in. Ethan crouched beside the dog. "No." Maggie met his eyes sadly. "He needs surgery." The word hit Ethan harder than expected. Ranger looked up at him weakly, old, tired, still trying to protect him. A memory surfaced suddenly. Afghanistan. Dust storms, gunfire. Ranger dragging Ethan behind cover after an explosion tore through their convoy. The dog had saved him more times than he could count. And now, Ranger was bleeding out in a frozen steel building because Ethan dragged him into another war. Guilt hit hard. Outside, engines roared suddenly across the valley. Clayton's final move. Floodlights exploded through the storm surrounding the hangar from 3 directions at once. Then loudspeakers crackled outside. "Ethan Mercer," Clayton's voice echoed through the valley. "This ends tonight." Ranger struggled painfully to his feet immediately, growling. Ethan moved toward the hangar doors. The storm screamed around the steel structure now. Snow blasted sideways through the floodlights. And beyond it all stood Clayton Voss beneath a black umbrella beside his SUV, calm waiting. The loudspeaker crackled again. "You have evidence that does not belong to you." Ethan stepped forward into the center of the hangar. People watched silently behind him now. Veterans, families, townspeople, his people. Ranger limped to Ethan's side despite Maggie trying desperately to stop him. The old shepherd stood beside his soldier one more time. Clayton's voice echoed again. "Last chance." Then the lights went out. Every floodlight around the valley died simultaneously. Darkness swallowed Black Hollow completely. For one long second there was only wind. Then Ranger barked violently toward the western wall. Ethan spun instantly. Shapes moved through the storm outside, multiple men, closing fast. And suddenly the war Thomas Mercer buried beneath the mountain 40 years earlier came roaring back to life. The western wall of the hangar exploded inward with a deafening crash. Snow and freezing wind blasted through the opening as armed men stormed into the darkness beneath shattered floodlights. People screamed. Children cried out. The old steel structure echoed with chaos instantly. Ethan moved before thought. "Down," he roared. Years of SEAL training snapped into place with terrifying clarity. He grabbed Maggie and shoved her behind a stack of supply crates just as another burst of gunfire shattered overhead lights. Darkness strobed, metal screamed. Ranger lunged forward, barking furiously, despite the blood soaking his shoulder. The old shepherd moved faster than Ethan thought possible. One intruder rushed through the broken wall toward the bunker entrance. Ranger hit him full force. The man slammed backward into steel shelving as the dog's growl ripped through the hangar. Hank fired once from behind cover. Wood splintered beside another attacker. "Move the families underground," Ethan shouted. Walter Grayson and several townspeople rushed terrified civilians toward the bunker hatch, while snow poured through the shattered wall. Outside, the blizzard howled like something alive. Then Ethan saw Clayton Voss calmly walking toward the hangar through the storm. No weapon, no panic, just certainty. That terrified Ethan more than the gunfire, because men like Clayton always believed somebody else would die for them. Ranger barked wildly again. Another armed man appeared through the swirling snow near the eastern entrance. Ethan tackled him hard against the concrete floor. The rifle slid away into darkness. For one brutal second, the man reached toward a side arm. Then Ranger was there again. The shepherd slammed into the attacker before the gun cleared the holster. The weapon fired once into the ceiling. Metal sparks rained downward. The intruder screamed and stumbled backward into the storm outside. But Ranger collapsed awkwardly beside Ethan afterward. Too hard, too fast. Ethan's heart dropped instantly. Blood spread heavily across the dog's chest now. Fresh blood. Gunshot. No. Ranger struggled to rise anyway. Still trying to move toward Ethan. Still trying to protect him. The sight shattered something deep inside Ethan Mercer. For one terrible moment, the hangar disappeared around him. Afghanistan returned. Smoke. Dust. Men screaming over radios. Blood on sand. Peasty crashed into him full force. His breathing vanished. His vision tunneled. Not now. Not Ranger. Another attacker rushed through the snow toward him. Ethan raised the rifle automatically. Rage exploded through him so violently it drowned everything else. The years, the grief, the loneliness, all of it erupted at once. He drove the man backward against a steel support beam with brutal force. The attacker fell hard onto the concrete floor, dazed. Ethan raised the rifle. The man looked terrified now, and for one horrifying second, Ethan wanted to pull the trigger. Not from fear, from rage, pure exhausted rage, war rage, the kind that destroys men long after battle ends. Then Hank Rollins grabbed him hard from behind. "That's enough!" Ethan struggled instinctively. Hank slammed him against the steel beam. "Look at me!" The old veteran's voice cut through the storm inside Ethan's head. "War already took enough from us." Silence crashed suddenly through Ethan's mind. The rifle lowered slowly. The attacker scrambled away into the storm outside. Ethan staggered backward, breathing hard. Then he heard it. A faint whine beside him. Ranger. The shepherd lay bleeding heavily on the concrete floor, still conscious, barely. Ethan dropped beside him instantly. "Stay with me." Ranger's tail moved once weakly against the ground. Snow blew across the hangar floor, around them through the shattered wall. Walter shouted from near the bunker entrance. "Federal vehicles!" Everyone froze. Far beyond the valley through the blizzard. Flashing emergency lights finally appeared climbing the mountain roads. Multiple vehicles, government SUVs, state police, snow rescue units. Clayton Voss saw them too. For the first time since Ethan met him, the man looked afraid, truly afraid. Clayton turned immediately toward his SUV. "Move!" he shouted to his remaining men. Panic spread among them instantly. Too late. Police vehicles roared into the valley through the storm from 3 directions at once. Floodlights cut through the snow, illuminating the hangar like daylight. State troopers poured from the vehicles, shouting commands. Federal agents moved directly toward Clayton's SUV. The developer tried to flee. He made it maybe 20 yards before officers dragged him face first into the snow. The storm swallowed his protests immediately. Around the hangar, the surviving intruders surrendered quickly. The war ended almost as suddenly as it began, but Ethan barely noticed. He sat on the freezing concrete beside Ranger, holding the old shepherd's head carefully in his lap. Blood soaked through his gloves, too much blood. Maggie knelt beside him fast. "We need to move him now." Ranger's breathing sounded wet, painful. Ethan felt terror rise harder than any firefight he'd ever survived. Not the dog. Please, not the dog. A veterinarian from town arrived inside the hangar, moments later with emergency supplies. Older woman, gray braid, steady hands. She examined Ranger quickly while snow swirled around them. Then she looked up at Ethan. "He's alive," she said carefully. "But barely." The words punched through him. "We can stabilize him in town." "Do it." The veterinarian hesitated. "The roads." "I said do it." His voice cracked hard. The woman nodded immediately. People rushed to help. Hank brought blankets. Walter cleared space in the truck. Maggie held IV bags while the veterinarian worked, and Ethan stayed beside Ranger the entire time, holding him, talking quietly to him. "You're okay. I got you. You hear me?" Ranger's eyes stayed locked on Ethan the whole time, trusting him completely, like always. Outside, federal agents searched the bunker while storm crews struggled to clear the roads. One younger agent approached Ethan cautiously near the truck. "Mr. Mercer?" Ethan barely looked up. "We found the files. No response. The evidence appears legitimate. Still nothing." Then the agent said quietly, "Your father was telling the truth." That finally hit somewhere deep. Thomas Mercer had spent 40 years carrying the weight of this secret. 40 years protecting evidence, protecting strangers, protecting Ethan from the same darkness that swallowed so many veterans. And now Thomas was gone, but his son remained. Ethan looked toward the mountains disappearing beneath the storm, toward the valley his father built, then back toward Ranger, struggling to breathe beneath layers of blankets. The old shepherd opened his eyes slightly. Ethan leaned closer immediately. "Stay with me." Ranger's tail tapped weakly once against the truck bed. The veterinarian closed the rear doors carefully. "We're going." The truck pulled slowly into the blizzard toward town. Ethan sat beside Ranger in silence, while red emergency lights flashed across the snow outside. For the first time in years, he prayed, not for himself, for the dog who had carried him through every darkness he survived. The storm finally broke 3 days later. Sunlight returned slowly to Black Hollow, like something fragile waking after a long illness. Snow still buried most of the valley, but the sky above the mountains had turned clear blue again for the first time in nearly a week. Ethan Mercer sat alone in the veterinary clinic beside Ranger's bed. The room smelled like antiseptic, old wood and coffee left too long on a warmer. Machines hummed softly beside the sleeping dog. Ranger's chest rose and fell slowly beneath layers of blankets. Fresh stitches crossed his shoulder where the bullet had torn through muscle. Alive, barely. The veterinarian, Dr. Elaine Porter, stepped quietly into the room carrying a clipboard. He made it through the night. Ethan let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. Elaine smiled softly. "He's stubborn." "Yeah," Ethan whispered. "That's his worst quality." The older woman checked Ranger's bandages carefully. "He'll walk again." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Thank God." "But he's old," she said gently. "You need to understand that." Ethan nodded once. He already knew. War aged dogs faster than people. Maybe trauma did too. Elaine squeezed his shoulder before leaving the room quietly. Ethan sat back down beside Ranger. Outside the clinic window, Black Hollow was slowly returning to life. Snowplows cleared roads. Smoke rose from chimneys. People moved carefully through the streets, carrying supplies between houses. The valley looked different now, lighter somehow, like a wound beginning to close. A soft knock came at the doorway. Walter Grayson stepped inside, carrying a thick envelope. The old lawyer looked exhausted. "You look terrible," Ethan muttered. Walter smiled faintly. "So do you, fair enough." The old man sat carefully in the chair beside him and placed the envelope on Ethan's lap. This was found inside the bunker. Ethan stared at it. Thomas Mercer's handwriting crossed the front. "For my son." His chest tightened instantly. Walter nodded toward it. "You should read it alone." Then the old lawyer quietly left the room. Silence returned. Ranger shifted slightly beneath the blankets, but did not wake. Ethan stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. Inside rested several folded pages yellowed with age. His father's final letter. Ethan unfolded it slowly. "Son, if you're reading this, then Ranger did his job and you finally found your way home. I imagine you arrived angry, maybe tired too, maybe convinced nobody was waiting for you anymore. I understand that feeling better than you know." Ethan swallowed hard. Outside, sunlight reflected off the snow so brightly it hurt his eyes. "I spent many years wondering whether I made the right choice staying away from you. Truth is, there wasn't a right choice. There was only survival. Your mother was drowning after Claire died, and I believed keeping distance might save what little peace you still had left. I was wrong about many things, but never about you." Ethan rubbed one shaking hand across his face. The letter continued. "You became exactly the kind of man I hoped the world wouldn't destroy." That line broke something open inside him, because nobody had ever said those words before. Not once in his entire life. Thomas's handwriting grew rougher farther down the page. Black Hollow was never supposed to become a hiding place. It was supposed to become a refuge. The letter described plans Ethan had never seen. Small veteran cabins built along the ridge, workshops for retired soldiers, trauma recovery programs using military dogs, woodworking spaces, fishing docks, therapy trails through the forest, a sanctuary, not charity, purpose. Thomas wrote, "Broken men heal differently when they still feel useful." Ethan stared at the words while tears finally blurred the page completely. For years he had believed his father abandoned him. Then he believed his father protected him. But this was bigger. Thomas Mercer had spent decades building hope for people he would never meet. The letter ended simply. "I knew someday you would arrive here carrying ghosts. Most soldiers do. But son, I need you to remember something. The valley was never waiting for evidence. It was waiting for you. And not just you. It was waiting for every tired veteran who still needed somewhere to stand back up again. I hope you stay. I hope you build it. And I hope someday another lost soldier walks through those doors and realizes he is not alone anymore. I love you, Ethan. Always did, Dad." The room went completely silent. Ethan lowered the letter slowly into his lap. Then, for the first time in years, he cried. Not quietly, not carefully, real grief, real relief. Everything he had buried for decades came apart beside that hospital bed. The war, Claire, his mother, the loneliness. The years sleeping in trucks and drifting from job to job because nowhere had ever felt like home. Ranger slowly opened one tired eye. The old shepherd watched him silently from beneath the blankets. Ethan laughed weakly through tears and rested his forehead gently against the dog's neck. "You stubborn old bastard." Ranger's tail thumped softly once against the bed. Months passed. Spring came slowly to Black Hollow. Snow melted down the mountainsides into rushing rivers. Pine forests turned green again. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth near the valley roads. And the hangar changed. Workers from town rebuilt the shattered walls. Federal investigators cleared the bunker. The old communications building transformed piece by piece into something new. A sign appeared at the entrance to the valley by midsummer. Mercer Ridge Veteran Recovery and K-9 Sanctuary. People started arriving quietly after that. A Marine from Idaho struggling with PSD. An Army medic sleeping out of her car. A retired military police officer carrying scars nobody could see, and dogs, old military dogs, retired police canines, animals too damaged or too aggressive for normal shelters. Ethan trained them patiently beside Ranger every morning beneath the mountains. The old shepherd moved slower now. The limp never fully disappeared, but he stayed close beside Ethan every single day, always watching, always working. The woodworking shop opened in autumn. Veterans built tables, cabinets, fishing docks, and wheelchair ramps for nearby towns. Some days nobody talked much. Other days stories filled the workshop until midnight. Healing happened quietly there, not through speeches, through purpose, through work, through people finally understanding each other without needing explanations. One winter evening, nearly a year later, snow began falling softly across the valley again. Ethan sat alone on the porch outside the main lodge, sharpening old tools while Ranger slept beside the doorway wrapped in blankets. Warm light glowed from inside the building where several veterans played cards near the fireplace. Peace, real peace. Then headlights appeared slowly at the front gate, an old pickup truck, rust-eaten. Exhaust coughing hard in the cold, Ethan stood slowly. The truck stopped near the entrance sign. For a long moment, nobody got out. Then finally, the driver's door opened. A young man stepped into the snow. Maybe 23, Marine Corps jacket, exhausted eyes. Beside him climbed a wounded Belgian Malinois, limping badly on one front leg. The young Marine carried a backpack that looked like everything he owned. Ethan froze, because suddenly he was seeing himself. Years earlier, older, broken, lost. The young Marine hesitated near the gate like he wasn't sure he deserved to walk any farther. Ranger slowly stood beside Ethan despite his aching joints. The old shepherd walked carefully through the snow, toward the younger dog. The Malinois stiffened at first. Then Ranger gently rested his muzzle against the younger dog's neck. Calm, safe, welcome. The Marine's face crumpled slightly. Ethan walked forward through the falling snow until he stood in front of him. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, the young Marine cleared his throat. "Someone at the VA told me about this place." Ethan nodded once. The young man looked embarrassed suddenly. "I can leave if... You hungry?" The Marine blinked. "What?" Ethan glanced toward the warm lights glowing from the lodge windows behind him. "You don't have to sleep in the cold anymore," he said quietly. "Come inside." The young Marine looked down hard for a second, like he was fighting not to fall apart. Then he nodded once. Ranger turned slowly toward the lodge, with the younger dog following close beside him through the snow. Ethan watched them disappear into the warm light together. And somewhere high above Black Hollow Valley, wind moved gently through the pine trees surrounding the land Thomas Mercer protected for 40 years. Not because it held secrets, because it held people, lost people, broken people, waiting people. And now, finally, they had somewhere to come home to. If this story meant something to you tonight, type home down in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones still standing after life tried to break them. And every veteran deserves a place where they're not forgotten. And if stories about loyalty, justice, and second chances still matter to you, sucks and come sit with us again for the next story.